Hello and welcome to the virtual Aurora Spring Forum, brought to you by our sponsors Barclays, Greencoat Capital, MUFG and Osborne Clarke. As you know, this event was meant to be delivered in Oxford. However, due to government recommendations, we decided to bring this event to you virtually instead. And we have the opinions and thoughts of the experts in the energy industry who would have been there.
Well, welcome everyone online and not in person today to this session at Aurora's 2020 Spring Forum, delivered virtually, on global net zero by 2050. Could we? Should we? And will we? These are perhaps three of the most important questions for the energy industry, not just in the UK and globally. And I'm delighted to say that we have some of the key thinkers and key players in the virtual room with us today to answer those questions. So I'm delighted to introduce Llewelyn Cozzi from the International Energy Agency. She is the chief energy modeler there, and she's working on the forecasting work of the IEA and modeling work, and obviously also the messages that emerge from that, in particular, the World Energy Outlook, which I guess many of you will have read over the years. With a background in engineering and economics, she's well positioned for this conversation. Also like to welcome Steve Halliday, the former CEO of Wood Mackenzie, who's been instrumental actually in thinking about the energy sector and the analytics behind the energy sector over a couple of decades after an initial career in the oil and gas industry. I think Steve, as you will see, has a pretty clear vision of where the future is going in this space, and he's always interesting to talk to. So welcome, Steve. We're also delighted to have Jeremy Taylor from Green Frog Power with us. Jeremy's founder and director of the company, and has really, jointly with his colleagues, taken what was a small little startup, even just 10 years ago, I think 2010, to now a really substantial player with over 0.5 gigawatt of operational peaking plant that can ramp up pretty quickly and is a key part of maintaining the grid at full functionality at the present time. And then finally, my friend and colleague, Chris Llewelyn-Smith. So Chris has had all the big jobs in physics, you might say, having been Director General of CERN, where the Large Hadron Collider was approved, has had roles with ITER, the fusion reactor, has been on the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology, and has been, most importantly, Director of Energy Research at Oxford University and is a fellow at the Smith School. So that is the cast of characters that we have with us today. It's a very good cast. And hopefully we're going to be able to get to the bottom of these three questions. Could we, should we, and will we? So to start the discussion, I'd like to focus on the could we question. Is it actually technically possible to get to net zero by 2050? And there are different views out there. And I'd like to ask Laura, if you don't mind, to kick us off with some thoughts as to whether this is actually kind of physically, from an engineering point of view, is it even feasible that we might get the whole world, not just the UK, not just leading rich economies, but everywhere, to net zero by 2050? Laura.
Thank you very much, Cameron, and thank you for hosting us digitally today for this very crucial topic that will remain with us even after this COVID crisis is behind us. So let's start maybe with a couple of data of what's happening and what has happened over the past couple of years. Last year, 2019, what we have recorded is actually a flattening of global energy-related CO2 emissions. And this is actually the first thing that needs to happen before we see a steep decline. Now, if we dig into the data of last year, I think there are some lessons that are important for the future. When we look across geography and across sector, there is a clear winner, someone that is running very fast, and is the power sector in advanced economies. Power sector in advanced economies has declined very steeply its emissions, with coal basically going out of the power sector progressively. UK was one of the key leaders there, but this has happened also in the United States, where gas has pushed out coal, in Japan, in all parts of Europe. So we have a front runner there, which is the power sector, and is running very, very fast. Is this happening globally? Not quite. So we have seen increase still in power sector emissions in Asia, where coal use is still going up. So there is some question marks there. Having said this, if there is one sector that can certainly achieve net zero by 2050, is the power sector. We have the technology, solar, offshore wind, low carbon technologies in general are there, are available, are becoming more and more affordable. And there are really no big technological issues there. There is a flexibility issue and the variability issues that has to be tackled, but we have the instruments to tackle this flexibility. So we are kind of positive about the power sector if governments put the right condition in place. However, let's take a step back. If we look at electricity today globally accounts for 20% of final energy use. There is 80% of final energy uses that are still provided by natural gas, oil, and coal. This is heating, it's industrial uses, and it's transport. This is where we're seeing sectors lagging behind. And this is where we're seeing a huge, huge need of innovation, not only deployment, innovation in specific sectors where we need to put our government's mind, our best minds in industry to work to accelerate innovation. When we say accelerate innovation, if you look at innovation in the past, in the energy sector, we've seen innovation lasting from early stage of ideas to when we reached a certain 1% in the market, going from 20 to 80 years. If we need to make it in the next 30 years, it means that for this harder to abate sector, we need to run much, much faster.
And Laura, do you think it's possible?
It's possible if we put all our minds to it. Currently, clearly climate change has risen to the top of the agenda of policymakers until 2 months ago. Now we are having a huge crisis, global crisis. For me, it's going to be a fundamental question whether stimulus packages that will be adopted around the planet will put central the clean energy transition. So if we all put our minds together, of course, we need to give a hope and for our generations. I have a lot of faith in ingenuity and in the humanity. So we have to do it. Currently, we are not on those trends.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. So a call there that it is possible, technically possible. Questions about the difficulty, which we'll come back to in the third part of the discussion about will we get to net zero by 2050, but a call there that is possible. Now, Jeremy, I understand from our previous discussions that you may want to raise a few question marks about whether this is in fact possible. Can I bring you in for your thoughts then?
Sure, thank you. I would be delighted if it were possible, if we could achieve it. I think it's a noble aim, but I do think it's completely impossible as things stand. I mean, a complete pipe dream. Our achievements so far in cutting carbon dioxide, I think, have been absolutely minimal. There's a theory we've cut them by 40% in this country. I don't think that's really the case at all. I think that's not taking the right benchmark, and there's a lot of difficult but yet muddy economics surrounding the achievements so far. If we had had no renewable energy, we'd now be sitting, we can hope on, we can imagine on 60% efficient gas turbines, which would have replaced coal, and we'd have our own fracked gas, and we would have had less carbon dioxide than if we had wind, solar, and a whole lot of either inefficient plant or plant running inefficiently to compensate. And we wouldn't have had a doubling of electricity prices. There's a growing political resentment, I think, against the green lobby, which is only going to continue when we go from nearly doubling our electricity prices to trebling them. So I think it's politically impossible. Technically, we're relying on carbon capture and storage, which has barely been invented. I mean, sure, it works in theory, but sure, we can put the whole population of Britain on the moon if we need to. Things are technically possible, but that doesn't mean they're financially or politically viable. We're trying to replace a whole gas network with hydrogen somehow, or failing that, and we're trying to insulate our houses and not sure about the cost of that. and we're trying to ban gas boilers, hydrogen boilers, and go to electricity, which means a vast amount of more electricity, which isn't going to come from wind and solar because it isn't produced when we most need power. It's going to come from nuclear or from carbon capture and storage or something we haven't invented yet. So I think, nice though it would be, it is a complete pipe dream. And it's not going to happen well, that's for another discussion.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. You're jumping ahead to part 3 of this conversation. But so a strong call there on political impossibility. And I don't think I heard you say technically impossible. I heard you say technically very difficult, and we need some innovations in technologies that don't yet exist, which I think, if I'm right, actually, you could almost see that as being consistent with what Laura said. Can I put that to you?
Sure, but I think there's a question of optimism. I'm very optimistic, and the future for my company, it could be fantastic. We know how to build batteries and small flexible power stations. My views do not reflect my company, I hasten to say, necessarily, but I think there's always got to be, in power generation, it's got to work financially. Now, it's easy to say, okay, the government must just give us all more subsidies. But we're at the limit of subsidies purely through power prices, and that means there has to be central taxation, and that raises the question of what else should we be doing with all our money, because the costs of this look as though it's very poorly costed so far, but it looks as though it's going to exceed all our other public spending on good works, and therefore we're backing a single horse or proposing to. Okay. And that won't work politically.
So a very strong claim there about financial impossibility. Now, and also you made the interesting point, which my friend and colleague Dieter Helm and I make from time to time, about the difference between production and consumption emissions. Now, I know we have Steve Halliday with us. He's sitting there, I think, with a copy of Dieter Helm's book, Burnout, although not on the bookshelf. I gather it's propping up with the iPad, Steve. But I wonder if you might come in on the question of financial impossibility.
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say, and sorry about that, Dieter, but the book is a perfect size, is that we clearly can. I've been picking up on people at Edinburgh University involved in carbon capture and storage for many years, and they get very frustrated at this debate because there are so many technologies that are in place. So if you look at it, it's more simple. We can. Look at what's happening with COVID-19. When people put their minds to things, we can. Now, I've got huge sympathy, Jeremy, with everything you're saying about practicality. On the finance side, and we'll come back to this later maybe, Cameron, it is about money. This is about money for me at the heart of this debate, and about the need for change. You can say whatever we want, but this is about the flow of capital. And I actually think if the financial markets really deem that this is necessary, we'll come back to this, then I say we can. And let's see how that plays out. It's already dramatic changes in the financial markets.
And do you think, Jeremy made the point there about very large scale public spending in order to make this transition happen, even, I can't remember your exact words, Jeremy, but exceeding other public spending on public works. Is that a view that you would agree with?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've just seen it in the last week, what's possible. I mean, I think, remember, could we? This isn't for me, this isn't a question about all of the qualifications to that. Could we? Yes, we can. Sound like Obama, don't I? But yes, we can on this one. And I think if people and governments make that decision, yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So turning to Chris now, perhaps really zooming in on some of these technologies. Laura made the point that in the harder to abate sectors, we're going to need some innovation. In short, the final suite of technologies may not completely exist, at least at a point that is ready to be deployed at scale. Chris, I know you've been thinking about these harder to abate sectors. I wonder if you might comment on the technological possibility of getting to net zero by 2050.
Thank you, Cameron. Well, I definitely think it's possible, though I understand that, as Jeremy says, it's very difficult. Just a couple of things on the negative side first. Jeremy is quite right that the advertised reduction in emissions in the UK is because we've deindustrialized, and the imported emissions in the UK have actually gone up 28% between 1997 and 2016. I'm also a little bit alarmed on the negative side with people talking about CCS. If I look at the Committee on Climate Change's claim that we can do it, it's heavily reliant on CCS, and they assume you can capture 95%. You can, but it'd be very expensive, and it's not been proved. And they also are rather cavalier, in my opinion, in the way, in fact, I think the world is cavalier in the way that they treat methane emissions. So I think CCS it's going to leave emissions because it's not perfect, and there are upstream methane emissions, and net zero means you've got to offset them. And in the scenarios I've seen, we're reaching the limit of how much we can offset. So that's the negative bit. On the positive side, Laura's quite right that 20% is only power, but it's all going to become power. More or less everything is going to become electrified, in my opinion. I don't understand Jeremy's remark about the cost of electricity. The cost of wind and solar are plummeting. They're going to go on plummeting for technical reasons and because we're getting it right with CFDs, which have brought the cost down in this country. On the technical side, I can see solar. We're going to be soon seeing perovskite tandems, which will be beginning to be mass manufactured. We'll put the efficiency up to maybe 26% or more. That will reduce the cost of the balance of plant. As far as wind's concerned, I wouldn't be amazed if floating wind farms turn out to be cheaper than fixed, maybe, maybe not, but I'm very impressed by the performance of high wind. And I'm very interested, because I've got interested in hydrogen and ammonia, in the idea of putting electrolyzers on offshore wind farms. It saves costs. It's cheaper to bring gas to shore than electricity, it turns out. And it's also the case that you can save a lot of money on inverters if you do that. So I actually think, if you wanted my guess, but of course, futurology is always wrong, we're going to move very much to a hydrogen and ammonia economy. I'm working on a big study of storage for the Royal Society, which I'm leaving. It's going to be difficult, but it can be done. And I can see us moving, not entirely to renewables. No, we're going to need some nuclear. It would be very good to have some flexible base load. That's quite difficult because anything with CCS, first of all, you shouldn't be doing it if it's gas, but it's relatively inflexible. BECCS, of course, you can do because it's negative, however inefficient the CCS, but it's a bit inflexible. But there are other options out there. For example, methane fuel cells with CCS, that's flexible, that can be done. So I think there are technical advances coming, and I'm rather optimistic we're going to get into a virtuous circle of falling costs and rising deployment.
So thanks, Chris. You put both sides of the case there. I was going to challenge you on each one after you put the negative and then the positive, but you've challenged yourself, I think. So it sounds like you've said that it's difficult, but it also sounds like that you think with this spiraling of costs downwards and with the transition to clean hydrogen, clean ammonia, that this is maybe not as difficult as you said it was. So can I seek a kind of reconciliation? If we do have this world where your electricity costs have really tumbled, ammonia is cheaper than oil and gas to move around the world, why is this hard?
Well, first of all, let me just say one more negative thing, if I might, that we're all talking about energy. Don't forget land use. And I'm not an expert on that, but that's a really important sector. If we have an expert, we should come back to that. I think it's hard because changing anything is hard. This problem's going to be solved when the clean alternatives are cheaper than fossil fuels and acceptable. But I think part of my optimism is a study that our colleagues did, Rupert Wade, Doyne Farmer, and a lady Mealy in Cambridge, who've looked at 4 scenarios out to 2050. And they've taken costs from learning curves, from Wright's law and Moore's law. And to their surprise, I think, they found that the greenest scenario in 2050 is the cheapest. So then I immediately asked, yes, but isn't there a big hump to get over? And it turns out not. It's the cheapest the whole way. Now, I don't know if that study is right. It hasn't been peer reviewed yet. It's not published. But they did not start out with that prejudice, I don't think. But it's rather encouraging that that doesn't look as if there's a financial hump along the way to get to. So I can see it happening. But we're going to come to Will later. So let me not trespass onto the other question.
All right, thank you, Chris. And I should just say Penny Mealy is both brilliant and at Oxford, as well as at Cambridge. So you better not misattribute her brilliance to Cambridge. We certainly wouldn't.
Thanks. I'm the only one of those authors I haven't met.
Well, she's great and was one of my former doctoral students. So moving along to the question of should we? So I think we're going to conclude that we can technically, and as Chris pointed out, that the focus in this discussion is on the energy sector, but of course there's other sectors to think through here, both to solve challenges in those sectors, but actually they can also be part of the solution. The land use sector and agricultural sector is itself undergoing a transformation that could help get globally to net zero. But let's keep the focus on energy. So a general agreement that technically this is possible, some divergence of views as to how much it might cost, whether we have the political will, and I guess none of that is surprising. So let's dig into the question of whether this is actually a good idea. Should we? Now, Laura, I think you started with the question or the proposition that we must do it, and necessity is often the mother of invention. I think that was you. Apologies if it wasn't. But let's turn back to you to say, why must we do it? What's the imperative of getting to net zero?
I think, Cameron, that here we are to be directed by what science says. And it's very obvious that the amount of evidence that the IPCC is putting forward in terms of costs of climate change are huge. So we have to be driven by this proposition that scientists are putting forward to us, and be driven by this. There is a lot of uncertainty about costs. Probably we haven't been done quite enough of the work that we should be doing in terms of understanding what are the costs associated with climate change. That is somehow one of the reasons why we are going slowly, because we don't quite capture how quickly the cost may vary and how much they may be. If I can do a small bifurcation here on the should we haven't touched upon a very important point, I think, which is a differentiation between two problems that we have in front of us. One is what we are building new, and all what we need to do in terms of policies, investments, and financing to make sure that what we build new is compatible with reaching net zero whenever it is. But the other point, which is hugely important and very often overlooked, is the existing infrastructure. If we simply look at the existing infrastructure and we continue to operate it without changing the norms of it, this will eat up 95% of our budget of well below /1.5. So when we talk about should we, it has to be a yes for the new, and it has to be a yes for the existing. But I think very little has been done in terms of thinking, how do we tackle the existing infrastructure?
That's a great point, and one which you probably know, our team at Oxford has done some work on as well, on committed emissions, it's so called. You probably know about the efforts in Germany to replace existing coal plants with thermal storage units using the existing grid connections and location planning, possibly even some of the existing kit in terms of turbines. Do you think that is a way forward of managing the existing asset base while minimizing the stranded assets for the transition?
I think we need to become extremely innovative. So if we look, again, I go back to what is the largest source of emissions today globally, including, and if you look at land use and beyond the energy sector, is one, and is coal use in power. Coal use in power emits globally be above 10 gigatons. The large majority of this coal today is 12 years old. 12 years old. You took the example of Germany. Germany has, after long negotiations and struggling domestically how to come to a conclusion, great decisions to phase out coal by 2038. If we do that globally, we will not meet well below 2, we will not meet 1.5. So imagine having the same discussion in India, where you have 75% of your power generation coal. Imagine having that discussion in China, where they're still installing new coal, in Southeast Asia, that is the only place in the planet where not only coal is growing in terms of absolute numbers, but also in terms of shares. So we really start discussing with those countries, because as my executive director repeats all the time, emissions from London, Cambridge, Brussels, Jakarta are exactly the same. So we should focus in engaging with those countries and understanding these 10 gigatons of potentially locked in emissions in coal assets. What do we do with them?
Yeah, and you might think that actually, should we get there by 2050, needs to be answered with the question, well, maybe that is a little bit too quick given the stranding. I could imagine that as a reaction. But equally on the climate side, in terms of the impacts, you might be thinking maybe it's possibly a bit too slow. So I'm not going to ask you in your role at the IA to weigh up these kind of difficult political questions, because ultimately it's a job for your member nations. But Jeremy, I might turn to you to have a go at weighing those points up. I guess the first question for you is, did you agree we need to get to net zero at some point? And then the second question, maybe answer them both at the same time, is, what is a sensible date for getting to net zero?
Well, that's an incredibly difficult question. Sensible date. We have, as well as a lot of pretty optimistic technical hopes, we have a lot of very difficult and quite often muddy economics to work through in order to construct a proper cost-benefit analysis of what we should do when. It would be very nice to get to net zero by 2050, but does that mean we should do it? We have to balance it against the losses that entails. And we have to consider also whether, for example, Britain, Europe should be engaging in trying to achieve net zero, because as things stand, that means committing economic suicide. We stop making anything, we all move into tree houses, and meanwhile in China and India, where a coal-fired station is being built, I believe every 2 weeks at present, they flourish. Can we blame them for wanting to flourish? They earn, I think the average wage or the median wage, I think in India is £1,000 a year. And there's real hardship there. And I can't blame people for wanting to build coal power stations there. Sub-Saharan Africa, it would be a major cleanup of pollution if there were more coal-fired power stations, because people would stop cooking with open fires in their house and the pollution would be further away from them, and their fridges would work, and so their children wouldn't die from eating rotten food. So this is a very difficult moral question, what we do when, and I think there's been a paucity of information. I know the Nobel Prize for Economics was won by I think William Nordhaus, who I understand argues that we should wait till the cost-benefit line is when we get to 3.5 degrees, but increase rather than 1.5. That's a huge difference, and it's a very difficult target. But I think the real problem is, as well as guessing at the economics to a certain extent, guessing at what's going to happen in the future, I think we've got a shortage of philosophers, Cameron. I think there are a lot of very difficult, I think there should be a philosopher instead of me for a start on this panel. I think these are very difficult questions, and they're not, we need philosophers to pose them, not to answer them. but to pose the questions: how do we balance what's good for our grandchildren versus what's good for us? Do we leave them a world with manufacturing and electricity, or leave them in tree houses and a nice and a cool climate? And I can't answer that, alas. Or even
I completely share and echo your call for more philosophers in this question, to the extent that I've ended up publishing myself in philosophy journals. There's not enough of it. But so let me see if I can challenge you on a few things there. You, what would you say to those who point out that China really isn't flourishing? The air is choking with pollution, or people are choking with pollution. 8.8 million deaths a year, according to the WHO, from air pollution in total. We can do all of this and do it cleanly, and possibly leave future generations with a capital stock that is more suited to their needs. So it's not a question of tree houses; it's a question of clean prosperity.
Well, I think that would be very nice. If China could go entirely nuclear, or wind, and then some magic intermittent generation when the wind stops, but that is very difficult, and meanwhile it's not an option at the moment, or not an option.
So why is the intermittent generation when the wind stops magical, especially as the founder and director of a company that actually produces this magical balancing load?
Well, yeah, we can do it, sure.
The answer to our prayers.
We're only too delighted, but we're not that efficient is the problem. Fast starting plant isn't very efficient, and it also creates carbon dioxide. There's no solar power, however cheap it is, when the sun goes down, when you most need electricity. And there's none, as we all know, even offshore wind has a base load of generates 40% of the year. Maybe that'll improve a bit, but sometimes it all stops, or almost all of it. And so you've got to have intermittent. And should we invent a new intermittent, clean carbon capturing system? If there is one, I'll be right there to install it. But until there is, it's a very difficult question about whether we should make the sacrifices, the climate change sacrifices, or whether we should make other sacrifices. And I don't know the answer. In fact, I don't even know how to put the question, but luckily you do.
We'll come back to Chris, I think, on the question of a medium to long-term storage and how we might balance our grids in a net zero world in a minute. But before that, perhaps I could turn to you, Steve, to engage in this question of the economics and the moral philosophy. Should we? Now, it's not just should we get to net zero, should we get there by 2050? Is it too slow, too fast? And, do you disagree, frankly, as I do, with my colleague Bill Nordhaus at Yale, who thinks that we don't need to? It's not really an urgent problem. We can take our time about it and gradually get there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones that, we have the kitchen cabinet at home. We definitely should. We should. I think it's pretty clear. I think, as an aside, a couple of points I would make. If you look at one of the side effects of COVID-19 is suddenly the canals are running clear in Venice. There's no pollution over London. There's no particulates, in the air above developed economies. And actually, okay, it's taken a crazy event to produce that, but it comes back to look at the impact on that on everybody. The one thing I would really pick up on to contribute to the debate is China and India. Now, what we're all saying is that the UK is doing what it can on coal, so is Germany, but China building a coal plant every 3 weeks, India continuing to grow. Now, interestingly, that need, though, is serviced by Western companies and Western technology, and at times Western coal. As part of the work I was doing to prepare for this, which I quite enjoyed, I was looking at Whitehaven Coal Limited, and it's a company it's Australia's biggest coal producer that is exporting vast amounts of coal to China, but to get financing, it had to go to Japan and China. Western banks won't touch it. And I think what's interesting here is you could move to a situation where China and India, if other countries are minded, could become closed economies. If you take this to its nth degree, yes, they can continue to do what they're doing, but no one is going to finance the companies that serve them. So the only companies that can serve their own needs will be intra-national. And I actually think there's some profound changes that will happen, which will mean that that path will mean that those economies will gradually be ostracized in terms of their products.
Yeah, so then you're getting into the question of should they risk going down that route, facing border carbon adjustments, possibly struggling economically potentially if they're excluded from the global trade system. Is that your point?
My point is it could become a rock and a hard place for them, because I actually think there's openness to technology, to support, to coal from outside their national borders, I think could dry up, and it could dry up because of the financial markets. Now, then there's this period of adjustment. But this idea that they can sail on building a coal plant every 3 weeks, I don't get it. I don't see it being sustainable.
Now, what about Jeremy's point that that there are moral questions on the other side here too? Maybe we could get to net zero by 2050, but if that involves people in sub-Saharan Africa living in energy poverty for longer, that's a serious issue, and maybe we should just build a whole lot more coal. Do you have a reaction or response to that?
No, my reaction is that the answer is in technology. We've talked about your good colleague Dieter's book a little bit, and that's what he really points to. And if you look at what's happened over the last 20 years in energy, I mean, I remember 20 years ago, shale oil was just, where was it? It was nowhere. And suddenly it's producing over 12 million barrels a day. And I think this, and particularly the answer there lies in solar, Cameron, would be where I'd go towards. What is possible? There are companies today already developing solar sheeting, low efficiency, that can be rolled out to create, power generation. And I'd have to say that's where my mind would go on that debate.
Yeah, okay. So we have this very cheap solar that could potentially, clearly on the numbers, power all of sub-Saharan Africa very easily. Chris, can I turn to you? Because I think one of the reasons Jeremy is saying that's not a sensible solution and may fail the moral test is because the sun doesn't shine at night. It's a point that has been made far too many times the last 5 years for my own sanity. And of course, the question then becomes, how are we positioned and will we position on the question of storage? And Chris, you're leading this Royal Society report on long-term storage. And this is connected, in a sense, both to the should and the will. But what do you think the costs might be of balancing solar and wind? And how might that affect the question of should we get to net zero by 2050?
Okay, before I answer that, I can't resist coming on the should question. The discussion of cost benefit, it makes me, let me put this politely, uneasy. I don't know how to cost Bangladesh going underwater. But I do know that if I look at the IPCC, it says that a 1 degree temperature rise, and we're a bit above that, the effects on crop yields will be undetectable or moderate. At 2 degrees, they'll be moderate or high. They say that coastal flooding at 1 degree is moderate. At 2 degrees, it's very high. And we've got to remember there could be tipping points, melting permafrost, changing of the Gulf Stream, melting of the Greenland ice cap. So I don't think you can talk about cost benefit given the uncertainties of tipping points and viewing the impossibility of costing some of the damage that's going to happen out there. I just don't think that's sensible. We know it's very large, the cost of climate change. That's all we can say. So on the should question, we've got to stop climate change, and the science says that means stopping emissions. I wish we could do it sooner. I don't think we're going to keep below 1.5 degrees, and I'd be very, very surprised if we keep below 2 degrees. Now, on the storage question, actually at the moment, we're doing what I think is the first proper study. The studies of storage have been inadequate. Many have looked at a single year. It turns out you can have decadal changes in the availability of wind, and you can have plus or minus 15% variations from year to year. And there are very rare weather events. So we're doing a really thorough thing with 3 stores. So we're looking at short, medium, and long. It turns out actually the heavy lifting, most of the throughput in a model, if you've got a really high renewables, is done by the medium-term storage. But you've got to have the short to deal with grid services, and absolutely vital, got to have the long. There are lots of technologies. I spent yesterday in a conference on medium-term storage out there. They will cost. The long will also cost. We haven't done a cost analysis yet. The National Infrastructure Commission came out with a report on cost recently. I think it's a very poor report, as a matter of fact, for a number of reasons. And I think they're over optimistic about the costs, and I don't think they've understood the weather difficulties properly. And I think they're disgracefully cavalier about nuclear. But nevertheless, you can do it. You want some nuclear, you want some flexible backup, but it can be done at a cost which will not be absurd. And I think the study of Farmer, Way, and Mealy, one of the things I immediately looked at was how have they treated storage? Because you're not going to believe this, but the studies of storage, and there are many, many, many out there, I only know of one, although they've done it and we've done it, who've recognized that storage is not 100% efficient. That has a huge impact on the amount of storage you need in the first place and on the cost. So we are doing it properly. It's work in progress. We haven't optimized for costs yet. That's going to be very difficult because there are so many uncertainties and you have to build scenarios and not into scenario building. But I don't think it's going to be impossible at all.
Okay, some very interesting perspectives there. Laura, you have a two-hander. Do come in.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to come in on Africa as we discussed about that a bit, and I think it's actually a huge issue. We have looked at Africa very much in depth last year with a very comprehensive analysis, and I think 2-3 points that for me were quite shocking. First of all, Africa from now to 2040 will witness the largest urbanization history has ever seen. To put that into perspective, it means that 600 million people will either be born or move to cities in Africa. In China, when we saw the big jump in China, 1990s, 2010, the same amount was 300 million people. So it's twice as large as the amount we've seen in China, moving or being born in cities. This will require a huge amount of infrastructure, streets, buildings, and so on and so forth. What we have done is actually to look and overlay the geography of where people will be born and what will happen to change in weather patterns. And we find that in 20 years' time, 1 billion Africans will live in places that will need cooling. Cooling, not like us that we have a nice cooled room, is they will need cool chains to keep the food not from rotting, to keep medicines and vaccines in refrigeration. And this will have huge, huge implications in terms of electricity needs, huge implications on electricity needs. We have discussed about coal. We haven't really talked about what's happening on the ground in terms of solar in Africa. Solar today in Africa, we have 5 gigawatts. Take entire Africa, 1.2 billion people, 5 gigawatts of solar installed. This is shocking, simply shocking. They have 40% of global solar potential. In theory, you can produce solar and have electricity generated at very, very, very low prices. Currently, Africans pay twice as much as an average European for electricity. This is, for me, shocking. So there are things that we know how to do today, we're simply not doing them right. So the should question for Africa is an absolute must, because there will be consequences on, in fact, the entire planet in terms of migration, in terms of a continent, entire continent that may not grow at the level it should, because we will not provide the right level of development and energy services in a proper way. But we have the technology to do it. We know how to do it.
Fantastic intervention. Can I stay with you just for a second? So it is a shocking number. Only 5 gigawatts of solar for all of Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. Why do you think that is so low, especially, as you say, given the sheer scope on the supply side to build out new solar, and actually, as you also point out, the sheer demand coming down the line? I'm delighted you're focusing on cooling. We have a fantastic program at the Oxford Mountain School on the future of cooling, and actually Aurora's been doing some thinking about this too. So it's clearly moving up the agenda as people realize that this is a big driver of electricity use. But so there's the supply, there's the demand, it's all there. What is needed to bridge the gap?
Investment. Investment are not flowing to Africa. Very little amount of money is flowing into infrastructure investments, in particular in the energy sector. And the type of investment we're seeing is very, I would like to say, old school thinking, that is development aid. This requires a complete rethinking of how we make investment in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. If you look at how many dollars of public money can leverage in terms of private sector money, sub-Saharan Africa would need, if we were to provide electricity for all in the next 10 years, we need the leverage ratio of around 4. You see leverage ratio of around 4 now in South Africa. Morocco has managed, but the rest of Africa is a leverage ratio of 1 to below 1. So for me, this is the key thing that needs to be cracked. How do we make sure that the leverage ratio changes? And I have to say, European companies are not necessarily going to Africa. China is going to Africa very much. 1/3 of investment in electricity in Africa are done by Chinese companies.
Well, that's a beautiful bridge to our third and final section of this discussion, because a lot of the will we question is about politics and finance, to my mind at least. Can we mobilize the trillions of capital that would be required to take us to net zero globally by 2050? And Steve, I might start with you here, if I may. The question, or the gauntlet that Laura's just thrown down, is that we know that the capital is needed at scales that it's not being provided at. It's obviously just a very large amount of money being infused into the global economy right now with COVID-19. Is there a possibility of joining these two things up and then completely irrespective of the virus? Do you think capital will flow? And if not, in the short term, what might make it flow? What might unlock the money required, Steve?
Well, you've linked quite a few issues there. I mean, I think I'd come back to the COVID-19 is that it's shown that in extremis, to an extent, anything is possible. I mean, that's what I'd be saying there. I mean, I think then I'd be differentiating between what happens in the West, let's call it the Western world, the industrialized nations, and Africa, because I think Africa has a specific dynamic because of the ROI challenges there. But if I could sort of set up this, I was chatting to some of my ex-colleagues at Woodmac, and let me give you a couple of points here. 2 years ago, when they wanted to talk about energy transition in Houston to E&P companies, they were very polite. The coffee was okay, but they were shown the door, really of no interest, nothing to see here. And you go on 2 years later, they are in huge trouble. And the reason they're in huge trouble is money and lack of finance. So there's been a dramatic change on a 2-year view. Now, that was before what's happened with the Russians and the Saudis. So what you've actually got here is that these companies are starting to cease to function. And I was looking a little bit, and I'll just pick out one comparison because there are many. And that's the comparison between Ørsted and Equinor. And what you have there is the history of Ørsted. It was Danish oil and natural gas. It was a conventional company. It switched to renewables. And I remember seeing that at the time and saying, oh, wow, that's why, is this a altruistic point of view? Is that just to give back to the planet? Why are they doing that? Now you roll forward to the current day, and Ørsted is now worth more than Equinor. And the fact that Dong, which was the old company, would be worth more than Statoil was unthinkable. And it's the return on money here, and the price-earning ratio of Ørsted is 35. Let me just get my number here, and I'll give you one more. Is 38.9. The PE ratio for Ørsted, 38.9. Equinor is 16. BHP is 6.9. Glencore is not applicable because they're not making any money. And I think what I'm saying here is that the profound changes in the financial system, the game is afoot, as Sherlock Holmes would say. And I think actually it's the power of money that will drive change here, which you and I have discussed.
Yeah, now a critique of that view might be just that the financial markets are getting it all wrong. They're faddish. They're piling into Ørsted without really thinking it through. Of course, the alternative view is that they're sensibly, rationally far-sighted, and they can see the E's going way up for that sector and it's going way down for the oil and gas conventional sector, and they're just behaving accordingly. But do you think it's some mixture of both? How would you do we trust the markets here?
Yeah, well, I think I'd just answer it in a slightly more holistic way. I would really, really not like to be running an oil and gas company. And that's a commercial point. It's not a moral point. It's simply that you could be they could easily be in a downward spiral here, which might have some recovery bumps. But really, the long-term future of big oil looks very, very bleak in terms of the economics, the geopolitics, the potential disruption in demand, and all of the above. And actually, even worse than that is mining, because, of course, with mining, there's a very difficult abatement question. But really, mining is in a very, very difficult position, big mining, in terms of their financial future. And that's because they really are positioned very badly on carbon. They're positioned very badly on economic impact, and they're positioned very badly in terms of investor appetite. It's very tough to see their long-term sources of finance.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I guess on the mining front, one could say they're also a key part of the future economy too, in terms of extracting the minerals required for the capital-intensive renewable kit that we need.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I talked to one of my colleagues who's actually the chairman of metals at Woodmac, and he just feels this debate is in its infancy in mining. They're just joining. Clearly, they're having to really act now, but they are in. I agree with you. Some of their metals. There are very interesting comparisons in terms of different metals and their impact on carbon. That debate, copper versus aluminium versus coal, which have profound impacts on carbon.
Right. Okay. So now on the financing, we've heard a strong push there from Steve that you wouldn't want to be running a fossil fuel company now. We're moving into the end game. We might already be in the beginning of the end for these firms. Is it game over, Jeremy, for the fossil industry? And if it is game over, then do we get to the question of, will we get to global net zero by 2050 with a slightly more optimistic view? I dare say you disagree, but let me put that to you.
Well, if it's game over, it's because the carbon taxes are so high and the subsidies for renewables are so high that there's no money in it for the fossil industry. And I'm not saying that wouldn't be a bad thing, but what that means is that people pay a huge amount more for their electricity. There's no magic here. It's simply people, financiers will follow the money. They'll finance good projects where they're going to make money on it. And the only way that happens in energy at the moment is with carbon taxes against fossil fuel and with subsidies for renewable energy. No renewable energy gets built without subsidies, almost none. And so it just means electricity prices go up. So maybe that's a good thing, but there's not some sort of magic change that's happening. It's just a purely result of changes to taxes and subsidies. And that's coming out of people's pockets. Will it happen? No, absolutely not a chance. I'm afraid it might happen in Britain because we're nice green people, but we'll be committing economic suicide. We'll be offshoring all our industries to China and elsewhere. And if we then put on carbon taxes and refuse to import it, we will be living in tree houses without mobile phones, which is even worse than just living in tree houses. Nobody else is going to comply. And we'll be left flooded because we haven't built any flood walls because we spent all our money on being green. And and with a fifth of our country given over, I think the land's going to be stolen from our farmers to plant forests, and we'll probably plant the wrong forest because we need to plant mangrove swamps, not pine trees. And so I'm afraid, much as I'd like it to happen, it's not going to happen. There's absolutely no chance, no sign of any of the Chinese government or Indian authorities stopping the march of coal. Even in Britain, we've missed all our targets for 80% reduction have been missed, or practically all of them. So it would be very nice, but I don't think it's going to happen. But if it does happen, it won't happen because of subsidies and subsidizing energy sources that don't work. It'll work because people come up with new kinds of energy systems. And for that to happen, that will come from the private sector, it won't come from government. And for that to happen, we have to have cheap electricity and low taxes. And we can't have those if we're pursuing pipe dreams of renewable energy. So it won't happen, but if it does, it's not going to. I wouldn't start from here.
Okay, I knew I could rely on you for an optimistic view. It won't happen, but if it does, it'll happen because of technology around low electricity prices. Do you think, like Chris, Llewelyn Smith, just anticipating something he's going to say and putting it to you? We've seen offshore wind come down in equivalent terms from 140 to 40. Obviously, that's 2012 prices, I think, but still. Floating wind might be cheaper. Solar keeps coming down. Is it not plausible that just the simple sheer economics of clean energy will drive this transition and possibly drive further innovation? Because as you say, once you've got very cheap electricity, a whole lot of other things follow.
Well, that would be great. I mean, there's got to be storage as well. So it's not just wind coming down and solar coming down, but there's got to be storage. In terms, no, I mean, I'm afraid not. I think it's a myth. This idea that wind has come down. It's still much more expensive. I mean, wind power is much cheaper when the wind isn't blowing. £40 a megawatt hour is a great price when the wind isn't blowing. But sure, there's a problem. There's a problem with that, because if what you're building is a wind farm, so the problem.
You're not disagreeing that prices have come down on wind?
Oh, sure, but it remains to be seen whether or not the £40 is a loss leader. But it's self-defeating anyway, because the more wind there is, the lower prices will be when it's windy. So
and it would be remiss of me not to point out just how good the Aurora modelling is on wind capture prices. The tool is just utterly brilliant. Anyway, those points are well taken. Chris, Llewelyn Smith, will we? In fact, by the way, I'm going to ask all of you to give me a date by which you think we will get to global net zero at the end of this discussion. So you can start thinking now. But Chris, let me bring you in here.
Well, first of all, on what Jeremy said, it's actually not true that we haven't met our climate targets. Were in the UK. We're not on track to meet the next one, but the first 3 budgets, they were all met, as a matter of fact. It's £45 in today's prices, by the way. Whether or not that will be, that's what people are actually going to pay, or the company that buys it. Whether or not that's a subsidy, we don't know. It depends on what the cost of the other things are at that date. But on the will, I think it's a matter of will, political will, and as was said, governments, as Stephen said, they've shown if they have the will, they can do a lot, and it's a matter of the will of investors. But I think public opinion is going to have a lot to say here. And in fact, China was said they're not doing anything, but public opinion has led to big efforts to tackle air pollution in China, no question about it. And I had a look at the latest poll in the US, it was 25th of November last year. 67% of US adults think the government is doing too little to limit the effects of climate change. I don't know what that means, actually, because it says limit the effects. It doesn't say limit climate change. By the way, 90% of Democrats think that. 39% of Republicans. Those numbers are going up. So opinions are changing in big players like the US. Obviously, they've changed in Europe, and they are changing attitudes to pollution. So I think that it's a matter of will, whether we will. What date we'll do it, I'm not sure we're going to do it at all. It's not going to be as soon as I would like. That's possibly all I'm prepared to say.
So, Chris, if you think we're not going to do it at all, that's possibly one of the most negative things I think I've heard you say in this realm. So, just elaborate a little bit more about that.
Well, I suppose eventually, if the effects are big enough, we will do it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if somebody came up and had a theorem that the COVID-19 was caused by carbon emissions, we'd be doing it. I mean, that sort of is a theorem that we can do it. So unfortunately, we may have to suffer before the will is there for us to do it.
And given the climate projections that the IPCC and other scientists work on, between now and 2050, could it be put to you that we will have these nasty effects that will change public opinion, that will lead to shifts in government policy and financial flows, and we will do it by maybe even before 2050? Let me just put a more aggressive scenario to you. What do you think about that?
I think that the trouble is there's a time lag. We're on track to see the really bad effects. That's the figures from IPCC I was quoting on the dangers of crop failure and coastal flooding, and there are many other metrics, of course. But by the time that happens, then people will take action, so the effects will be showing up 30, 40 years later. So let's say, I think we'll do it in this century.
So when you say the effects will take 30, 40 years, you mean because we won't strand existing capital stock? Or because you don't mean scientifically, if we stop emissions today, then temperatures stabilize 10 years later, roughly, is my understanding.
If we stopped emissions today, that's an interesting question. Actually, the science is unclear. The scientists tell us temperatures will stabilize. When you look into that, there are two conflicting effects, and I've been trying to understand which cancel out. That's difficult to understand. It comes out of models. I've got down to the bottom of simple models that I believe. There are some models, actually, if we stopped emissions, the temperature goes down a bit, but then it starts to go up again later. So there's a lot of uncertainty. And in the face of that uncertainty, and in the face of tipping points, I would say, we can't afford not to do it as soon as we can. But I don't think we're going to see the effects. If carbon dioxide was purple or something, we'd be worrying about it. But we're not going to see the effects manifest. Maybe you have in Australia, where you come from. I hope that's the fires have changed attitudes. Things like that are going to change attitudes, but they're happening, incrementally, and then it needs action, and then there's a delay. We need all the infrastructure, as Laura said, which is a really difficult thing and takes time.
Okay, so a fairly pessimistic answer to the will we question. Before the end of the century is as far as I could draw, Chris. There, I might come back to you for another crack later. Laura, can I get you to ponder that will we question, and in particular, just to sharpen it up, by when will we?
So thank you, Cameron. I think the answer to will we is the following. If we manage to create a grand coalition where we bring in together everyone that is interested in cutting emissions quickly, it can be industries, the public, governments, many different, the youth, then we will. How quickly? I don't know. I think that we need countries that show leadership and show that we can actually have economies that work and function at zero carbon. I think leadership here of the UK, of Europe, is going to be essential in showing that we can have expanding economy, expanding well-being, expanding growth with zero carbon, and then the rest of the world will follow. So we will have certainly a lag between when certain early movers will show to the world that it's doable. The effects that I very much share, that Chris said, the more we will see impacts, and we will certainly see them, the more there will be a rising awareness of the population, and the more this will push governments to act quickly. So hopefully at a certain point there will be a confluence of technology costs that will come down, etc., etc. However, all this, I have to go back to what said at the beginning about the role of oil and gas and not wanting to be an oil and gas company today. I have to say something. If we will, I think oil and gas have to be part of the solution. Oil and gas have the engineering, they've built the infrastructure that we will continue to need. The gas network that will be repurposed for hydrogen will still be there. So it's a matter of convincing the oil and gas companies to use the engineering and the innovation to bring to the next level. Up to now, there is another shocking figure for me, together with the 5 gigawatts for Africa. We looked at how much money oil and gas companies invested in green. And under the green, you put everything, including CCS that some of you may or may not like. You put everything together. Up to now, how much money, how much of their capital spending was devoted to this green? 1%. This is shocking. This has to change, and we need to work together with the oil and gas sector, because I strongly believe that they do have the solutions, both on the engineering, on the skills, and the deep pockets. But it clearly requires a big reinventing and rethinking, as some of the companies have. So the Grand Coalition has to encompass those oil and gas companies. Also, because we are talking about oil and gas companies that are in some parts of the world, including the Middle East, where a clever transition is needed, not only for them, but for the rest of the world, if we want to stay in stability.
Right. And can I draw you on a date?
We have it in our sustainable development scenario. We say the word net zero 2070.
2070. Thank you. And now, Jeremy, can I draw you on a date, or is your answer never?
No, I think it'll be really soon. I think it'll be sooner than 2050. Not net zero. No chance. I think full net zero could take a very long time, but I think we could get to something like 80% reduction or 90% reduction really quickly with a new technology that none of us has, or we barely thought of, or we have thought of, and suddenly it works, such as fusion. If someone comes up with a system, it will be brought in very, very quickly. You think of UK, our most useless form of generation, solar power, obviously not the country to have it. We now have 10 gigawatts, I think, built in an incredibly short time. Sure, with a government subsidy, but but as soon as something becomes economically viable, it will happen unbelievably quickly that it'll get built. And so I'm actually very optimistic that by 2040, we could have a very serious reduction from some technology we haven't really thought of, or we were thinking of in a different way. And I'm very optimistic, but zero, probably much longer.
Well, I have to say, if you'd said to me before this interview or this panel discussion began that Chris would say end of century and Jeremy would say 2040, we could be a long way there, I would have thought you were smoking something. Maybe Elon Musk had got you. But speaking of Teslas and Tesla drivers, Steve, can I bring you up and ask you for a date? When will we get there?
2055. You know, when you ask a chemical engineer that, you're going to get a deterministic answer. Just a quick point on that as well, though. We haven't actually talked about it. I remember when I was traveling to China a lot, the most popular app amongst employees was the particulates app. It was the PPM app, and they were looking religiously before, well, I use the term loosely, they were looking at it just before they went home. And the role, we're talking again back to what China's doing, the role of particulates in Beijing is massive on the population in terms of the underlying need for change. And the Olympics showed what was possible when they switched them all off. So so the answer to me lies in particulates. Jeremy's referred to technology. I think that has to be where the answer sits. And I think back to the final point on Lara was that all companies will do whatever they need to do to be rewarded by shareholders. It's as start as that. And if they start to be rewarded by shareholders for what you've described, they will do it. So anyway, 2055, I think it'll be a near miss.
Well, I appreciate the precision in your answer. Now, as Professor of Physics, Chris knows a bit about precision. And I'm going to draw you back, Chris. You've given me an answer. You said before the end of the century, but that, strictly speaking, encompasses an 80-year period. And I'd like to narrow you down somewhat. Can you be somewhat more precise? You can give me some error bars if you really have to.
Okay, so if you want a number, let's say 2075 plus or minus 10. But while I've got the microphone, I've got to comment on it. Can't avoid commenting on two other things. I think the idea that new technologies can be having a big impact in 2040 that Jeremy said is fanciful. To roll anything out on a large scale takes a long period. And anything that's going to be there on a large scale, even by 2050, has got to be out of the lab by now and in the demonstrator phase. Just something on the oil and gas companies and infrastructure. There's an interesting infrastructure number, which I'd like to quote. If you took, there's a huge infrastructure for making and distributing ammonia in the world. If you took the world's supply of ammonia for 1 year and turned it into power of 50% efficiency, which you could do, that would produce all the world's power for 6 days. So that shows that we can do things in storage in that case on a large scale, and that we have infrastructures which there are companies which can roll out. I'd also like to say, while I've got the microphone, if you'll allow me, Cameron, on the question of coalitions, I'm strongly with Laura there. And Cameron and I, with a colleague, Mike Mason, have just written a newspaper article saying that we'd like to, in the UK and COP, to come out with more focused coalitions. The coalitions that people have been talked about, they tend to say, oh, let's have a coalition on low carbon mobility. You've got to dig below that. You need to get down to the Lego blocks. So if you had a coalition based along the underlying technologies of hydrogen and ammonia, for example, that will be turbines, fuel cells, electrolyzers. You could have one around land use, which would be to do with CAM plants. We think we need to get coalitions of the willing with different relative advantages who would potential benefits, and that will be a way to push progress. And we hope that we can persuade the UK government to adopt that point of view at COP.
Great. Well, we are out of time, everybody. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking comments, your quantitative interjections, which is what we like at Aurora, and above all, for what was quite a sophisticated discussion about a set of fairly complicated questions. So those of you listening down the line, thank you for joining us. And please join me, at least in spirit, in thanking Sir Chris Llewelyn-Smith, Laura Cozzi, Steve Halliday, and Jeremy Taylor. Come back for other sessions from Aurora's 2020 Virtual Spring Forum. And we certainly hope that we will be seeing you in the flesh, in person, back in Oxford in 2021. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the virtual Aurora Spring Forum. And once again, thanks to our sponsors Barclays, Greencoat Capital, MUFG and Osborne Clarke for making this happen. Goodbye and stay safe.